my whole life had been pointed toward being a Marine. And again, it's easier to see this in retrospect than it was in the moment. But my whole world, my whole life, my whole identity was wrapped up in that uniform.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Real quick, before we get into this episode, I've got a sales pitch for you. I'm selling t-shirts for the podcast. You can go to my Instagram page at Paul Pantani and check them out. The post is pinned, and you can see the shirt options. There's a dark gray, military green, and a black option. The logo is inspired by the old G.I. Joe TV show. Hopefully you like it. I don't have a store set up, so you're going to need to message me if you're interested in buying one. You can send me a message through Instagram. You can send me an email, however you want to reach out to me. The incentive for you, though, is the shirts are $30, but if you pre-order by May 19th, which is Sunday, you'll get free shipping and you'll be entered in to win a free hoodie. So hopefully that's enough of an incentive for you to go check them out and order some. All right, on to this episode. My guest this time served as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. After returning from Iraq, he chose to get out for what he believed was best for his family. Problem is, he wasn't ready, and he struggled. He hadn't properly processed the loss of his Marines in combat, and he really wasn't prepared for what he perceived as his loss of identity. He's since found his new mission, helping other veterans through the Mighty Oaks Foundation, which he co-founded with Chad Robichaux. I'm sure you'll like this interview, so let's get into it. Here's episode 143 with Jeremy Stalnecker. You mentioned your offices are not here anymore.
Yeah, we had offices in Murrieta.
Is it the one right over, I used the reference of the Carlson Gracie gym?
It was right next door. Yeah, we shared a wall. So we were there until 2 years ago, and then for a lot of reasons, we wanted to build a headquarters. Support in Texas is good for veterans organizations, all of those reasons. We moved to kind of the north side of Houston. And so I commute. So that's my commute. Everything for me is in California. My family's in California. Everything's out here. So I just stayed. I fly there a couple times a month.
Was the origination of Mighty Oaks that office?
No, it actually started in the Woodlands, Houston area, where we are now. So that's how we ended up kind of right back there.
Got it.
And we had been in different places over the years. We now have, we started small, kind of very, like wherever we could find space, wherever we could find a location. But now we have 5 locations and we're a pretty large organization. So we got to pick. But in that whole process, we moved to Southern California, put our headquarters there because of the military presence here. It was a great space. I trained at Carlson Gracie, still do. So, for that reason, it was a good space. Friends with Charles down at Icon. So like that, it was great. We had a good office there, but we were growing quite a bit and wanted to build our own thing.
So I came to know about that specific office.
Yeah.
I had heard about your organization prior to that.
Okay. Yeah.
Had no idea that the office was there. So at my previous organization, I worked right around the corner in one of the little strip malls. The office.
Yeah. No kidding.
And a friend trained at Carlson Gracie.
Yeah.
And they had kind of like, I'll call it a lunchtime class session.
Yeah.
So I was thinking,
okay.
like
from 10 to 12, whatever it was. Yeah, yeah.
And I went over and they're like, yeah, sure. If you want to come over and, drop in and enroll. So I figured, okay, I'll get over there. And it never happened. But when I went to scope out exactly where the studio was, I happened to see the Mighty Oaks office.
Yeah. That was a great office for us. We've been in a number of places, but we actually built that out. It was awesome. 4,000 square foot warehouse, and we put offices in it, had a studio, and it was awesome. But long term, it just makes more sense to be in a place where you can buy land and build your own building and do that kind of stuff, which we could have done here, but Texas is much friendlier to real estate. And even so, our staff is like 32 salaried employees, and then a bunch of other people we pay during the year and do things. We have about 100 people that work with us. And even for that, Texas is friendlier to veterans and home ownership and that kind of thing. So it made sense, but I didn't like it, but it made sense.
Do you see yourself and your family moving to Texas?
I have a freshman in high school. I have 4 kids. My 2 older ones are out of the house. And then I have 2 in high school. When my freshman is out of high school, I think what we'll end up doing is probably trying to get a small place in Texas. My parents are here, my sisters, my aunts, uncles, my grandmother, like my whole world is here. I grew up in Hemet, of all places. And so my whole life is here. So I don't think we'll ever leave California. My son just got married. We're talking about having a kid. My daughter works in La Jolla. My other 2 kids don't want to leave. So we'll find a place there and probably split our time. But yeah.
It's amazing because so many people are, well, those of us who are here in California,
right.
We know a lot of people who are always talking, I want to get out of California.
Yeah, right.
And I get it if you're unhappy with everything, but it's really hard to justify, in my opinion, no matter how bad a state gets,
where are you gonna go?
Completely move away from your family.
That was what we were faced with is the organization's moving. I'm in a unique spot in our organization, right? I'm the CEO of our organization, so I travel a lot anyhow. So for me to say I'm going to be in the offices, 3 days a week, a couple weeks a month, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. So I am there. I have meetings. I do all the stuff I'm supposed to do. Not everyone's in that position, but I was. And so that was my agreement with our board was if I will commit to, flying back and forth, otherwise everything I have is here. I can't leave. So you're going to have to let me go if that's the alternative, So yeah, it's crazy. And the politics of California are crazy, but Murrieta, Temecula, I mean, this is an amazing place. It's not touched by a lot of the liberal politics in the state. Financially is the one thing you can't get away from, but yeah. So
my friends who live outside of California, I tell them in a joking way that Riverside County is definitely the red county
right.
for the state of California.
I always tell people we live in the Texas of California, right? You want to be in Texas. My son's a police officer in Murrieta, from Murrieta PD. And everyone outside of California is like, how in the world could you support your son going into law enforcement in California? I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's probably more conservative. Murrieta PD is probably more conservative than most police departments in the country, and Riverside County for sure. In fact, I've had Sheriff Bianco on my podcast, and yeah, we live in a unique place, and people don't understand that, I don't think.
We're in a little bubble.
Yeah, we are in a bubble for sure. Yeah.
Before we go too far forward, and I'm really interested in what you're doing with Mighty Oaks and helping veterans, but for your story, let's take you back to the beginning. So you already mentioned you grew up in Hemet. Is that where you were born also?
No, I was actually born in New York. My dad was working there, ended up moving to Indiana. So I didn't move to California until I was probably 8 or 9 years old. I think I just turned 9 probably. Moved to Orange County. My folks were from Anaheim. That's where they had grown up. And so, they kind of did the different jobs and different things and went different places and came home and then moved to the Valley. I actually lived in the city or the town of San Jacinto. A lot of people don't know the difference, right? So Hemet is kind of it's not that big, but the big place out there. But yeah, my parents moved out there. My dad was in ministry, and so went there to start a church, and took us, of course, and that's where we grew up. And for those that are familiar with Hemet, it's a different place now than it was when I was a kid. When I was a kid, it was a lot of retirees, very clean, very quiet. It was actually a fun place to grow up because you could, your parents didn't have to worry about you and that kind of thing. Things have changed there over the years, but yeah, so we've been in this area since then, off and on. I was in the Marine Corps and went away and came back, but yeah.
For your mom and dad, so were they both from California and initially went to New York and then Indiana?
Yeah, my mom and dad. So my mom is from like Pennsylvania or something. Not something. She's from Pennsylvania, but she was only there a short time. And so essentially they both grew up in Anaheim. I don't think either one of them was actually born in California, but they moved here very, very young. And so they're definitely from California. So we have all of our extended family out here as well. So when they had, kind of gone to New York for work, gone to Indiana for work, kind of a lot to that story, but that brought everyone back to California. My dad knew he wanted to be back in California. This was in, the mid 80s. And there was an opportunity to do that. So lived with my grandparents for a little while when I was a little kid, and then moved out to the Valley. So
was your dad kind of quoting the song lyrics, the son of a preacher man? I mean,
he wasn't. No, he wasn't. In fact, no one else in my dad's family, and he comes from a large family, 5 brothers and sisters, and, a big extended family. My dad was the only one that was in ministry. So, yeah, it was very unique to him. In fact, he left California for a ministry job, and that's what they kind of moved around a little bit. And for those that are familiar with ministry, when you're first getting started, that's kind of how it works sometimes, is you'll be here for a few years and there for a few years. So, yeah, very unique situation.
What about brothers and sisters for you?
I have 2 sisters, so I'm the oldest of 3. My sister Joy is an attorney. She lives up in Oregon. And then my sister Janelle owns some businesses in Orange County, actually, and she's done really well there. So, my sister in Oregon, she's here all the time. She actually, she lives there, but she is an associate dean at a law school in Orange County as well. So we're all kind of from here and always back here. And as much as we try to get away, we always end up back in the same place.
The chain might get some more links, but the anchor always stays.
We're always back. We're always back. And so, yeah, people talk about leaving, but where are you going to go? You're going to be back. Yeah. So we've always been here.
For you as a young man or a young boy growing up, were you a good kid? Were you kind of rebellious?
I think I was a pretty good kid. I got into trouble like any kid gets into trouble. First of all, I lived in, one of the smallest towns in America. So San Jacinto, Hemet, that area, for people that aren't familiar, at the time that we moved into, we call it the Valley in this area, but that town of San Jacinto, right? I think there were less than 10,000 people. There were probably 8,000 people that lived there. And there were more cows than people for sure. It's a dairy area, very, very agricultural. So I got into trouble like doing dumb stuff. But it was one of those, like, the police would come talk to me and my friends because probably they didn't have anything else to do, right? And they'd ask us what we were doing, and sometimes they'd get involved in what we were doing. So it just wasn't the kind of place where you got into a lot of trouble. As I got older, I actually decided pretty young that I wanted to be in the Marine Corps. And I think in a lot of ways that kept me pretty focused. Came from a very patriotic family, a Christian family, very conservative family. And that decision as a young teenager to go into the military and the influences I had around me who were also in the military really kept me focused on that. I was involved in sports and those kind of things. So I didn't have a lot of opportunity to get in trouble. And I really grew up in a pretty idyllic setting, I think. Yeah.
What sports did you play growing
up? My favorite was baseball. Played a lot of baseball. I was going to be a professional baseball player like every other guy in America, right? I was pretty good. I was a catcher. I caught for a lot of years. I was really good until I got into high school and realized that the little town I came from.
A little tall for a catcher.
And that became a problem. I was tall. I'm thin now. I was really skinny then. That was fine when I was like in junior high. But as I got older, the kids got bigger, and I just couldn't hang anymore. I remember I was probably in 8th grade, maybe 9th grade, telling my friends, I'm going to be in the Olympics. I'm going to play baseball in the Olympics. And I had no chance, and I had no idea. I was just talking about this with somebody yesterday, that I thought I could go to college and walk on to a baseball team or walk on to, basketball team, and not at all, right? Coming from a small town, you think you're a lot better than you are. So loved sports, though. Loved baseball, and loved playing it, but really kind of moved on after high school and I played softball. I played other things, but nothing too serious.
You mentioned deciding early on in your life that it was going to be the Marine Corps, and there were influences around you. Did you have it in your family as far as service? Didn't have it in my family. In fact, so I have 2 uncles that were in the military. One was a Navy corpsman, one was a medic in the Vietnam era. So during that period of time in the 70s, they weren't, neither one of them went to Vietnam. And I love my uncles. Both of them have passed away now. And they were my biggest cheerleaders, and I was going through the process of getting into the military and that, but their service was not exemplary. Like when I filled out my application for officer candidate school and they said, do you have anyone who served in the military? The answer was no, right? Because I didn't want that to be a hit on me. Right? Yeah, like don't look into that. But they loved me and they were very proud of me for serving. In fact, my uncle just passed away at the end of this last year and was just buried in the National Cemetery there in Moreno Valley. But that wasn't a big influence. My grandfather served in World War II. He was a truck driver. He was in Europe, but that just wasn't something we even talked about. Was your dad just at the tail end or just past Vietnam?
He tells the story about however that worked, his number being pulled in the lottery or whatever, and then the draft stopped before he went in. My dad would have been great in the military too. He's just wired that way. But it was right toward the tail end of that. And so he never served and went on to do other things. And so, it's interesting. And I get asked this a lot. Why the military? Why the Marine Corps? And the why the Marine Corps is a little harder for me to answer. But I do remember when I was 11 or 12 years old, my dad gave me this book, and it's called They Met Danger. I actually have it still at my house. And it was a book written to young men in the 60s by Boys Life or one of those magazines. They produced it. And it was stories of Congressional Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. And my dad gave that to me. He was cleaning out my grandparents' house and found it, gave it to me. And I read that. I read it so much. The binding on it, I've glued back on several times, right? And that stirred up for me as an 11 or 12-year-old kid, these thoughts of service and the military broadly, but doing courageous things. And that really lit a fire in me. And from there, we got to know some people who were kind of family friends that served in the military. One was very significant in my life, who was a Marine officer. His kind of extended family lived in our area, so they'd come visit. So I'd see him, several times throughout the year. He became a big voice in my life as it relates specifically to the Marine Corps. But that really stirred up in me, like, I can do that. I did enjoy sports. I was pretty athletic. It just made sense to me. So the Marine Corps thing is a little bit, I never considered another branch of service. And people ask, like, why the Marines? I just assumed that if you were in the military, you were a Marine, and particularly an infantry guy, right? Like, that's what you do. That's what the military is. And so, I joke when I was 14 years old, and I was 14, but I remember talking to my dad, who's starting a church, and I wasn't running from God or anything. That wasn't my heart. But I remember talking to him saying, "Hey, Dad, is it okay if I do something else, if I don't go into ministry? I just don't feel like this is for me. I've seen what you guys have done, and I appreciate it, but I don't want to be a part of it." And he said, "Son, do whatever God wants you to do. That's what you need to do," right? And that's a good answer for a dad, I think. You need to follow your path, do what you think God wants you to do. And I said, "Well, I think God wants me to enlist in the Marine Corps." He's like, "There is no way God wants you to enlist in the Marine Corps. That's not God talking to you. That may be a movie, maybe something else." But his only real pushback, so he did have that conversation with me, but his only real pushback was, if you really feel like that's what you should do, you can do whatever you want. We'll support that, but you have to go to college first. My parents both went to college as adults. They're both very educated, advanced degrees, but they did all of it with kids and jobs and the rest, working, all night to get their schooling done. So it was really important to them that me and my sisters had the opportunity to go to college. And so that was their only stipulation. And so in that process of, I have to go to college before I enlist, I didn't know anything, right? I didn't know anything about the military really, other than what I'd seen in movies or whatever. But I learned about commissioning programs, and the Marine Corps had a great commissioning program I could participate in while I was in college. And so I did, and I was commissioned at the end of my time in college.
What year did you graduate high school?
Graduated high school in 95.
And the college selection process,
yeah,
was it a tedious process for you? It
was pretty simple. My parents said, "We'll pay for it if you go to that college." So it was pretty simple. Again, we come from a very conservative Christian family. There's a very conservative Christian school, but it's a liberal arts school. So it's not a Bible school, but a liberal arts school in Florida. And that was the school they picked for me. And so, I laugh at this, right? Looking back, I have kids now. And so this is a dumb way to do things, but I got the college catalog. I don't even know if colleges have catalogs anymore. It's probably all online, right? But I got the college catalog. I looked at all the majors. I wasn't a great student. And I came across their criminal justice program. I'm like, well, if this Marine Corps thing doesn't work out, I can be a cop. That's what I can do. And I like watching cops on TV, right? Like, this seems like something I could study for a few years. And so I did. So I have a criminal justice degree.
Did they have an ROTC program, or was that
they didn't. It was, they didn't have any programs like that, but the Marine Corps has what they call platoon leaders class or platoon leaders course. You may be familiar with that, but it was for colleges like mine that didn't have an ROTC program or anything like that. And so you technically enlist in the Marine Corps into that program, go to officer candidate school while you're still in college. You have to drill a couple times. You're a reservist. You have to drill a couple times during your time in college. And then if you make it, you're commissioned. If you don't make it, then that's the end of your service. So it was a great program for me. And again, kept me focused and kept me on track.
So basically right out of high school, you enlisted in the Marines and also enlisted and started college. It's just that by graduating college, you went the officer route.
Yeah. So the way the program works, you can do it a couple different ways. The way I did it, they have a split officer candidate school program. So I went to officer candidate school after my freshman year of college. You have to have 1 year of college. Went to officer candidate school. So my official pay entry base date was that first day of officer candidate school in 96. And then you're in the reserves as a part of Education Command. So they have responsibility for you. But your contract is written such that if you don't graduate, you're dropped out of the military, out of the Marine Corps, with no benefits, nothing else. You're just there for that program. But if you graduate successfully, then you're commissioned. And so, yeah, great program. And then I went back to officer candidate school again after my junior year. That split program is horrible. You go back twice and it's terrible. But
both times at Quantico?
Both times in Quantico. Yeah, they have what they call juniors and seniors, right? So it's tough. It's 6 weeks at a time. But all that being said, for me, it was exactly what I needed. Again, my heart was to enlist in the Marine Corps. I just wanted to be a Marine. I didn't care about college. I didn't care about anything else. But it kind of split the difference for me, and it gave me the ability to begin that process while I was still in college. On the officer side in the Marine Corps, you have what was called an officer selection officer. So it is a captain who's responsible for all of those candidates. And so he was responsible for us while I was in college. So, like every other week we're getting together, we're drilling every semester. So it was just a great program for me, and a lot of people like me. But yeah, and I was getting a criminal justice degree. So, man, it was so good for me because the instructors in that program were all former law enforcement. They were, we had a retired Secret Service agent, retired Michigan State police officer who at one time was the head of sex crimes division for Michigan State Police. We had, a lot of other folks, a provost marshal who became, a really big voice in my life as well. He was a chief of police for the military. And so it was so practical for me going to this Christian college, far away from home, going there because my parents made me. I had these men with real life experience. It wasn't military experience, but very similar, speaking into my life and really helped me in a lot of ways. So it was very fortuitous. It was a blessing to be a part of that.
Never to the point where it put, I don't want to call it a doubt, but kind of a second thought in your mind of maybe not the Marine Corps, maybe I go the law enforcement route.
Yeah. I think what it did more than anything is it firmed up my commitment that if the Marine Corps is not my forever job, then law enforcement will be that job. And it opened my all I knew again of law enforcement was either what I saw on television or, the town that I came from, right? So there's local law enforcement, like the PD. As part of the program that I was a part of, I interned with Riverside County Sheriff's Department. It was amazing. I mean, I loved it. And it was all patrol. It was super cool, right? And I loved it. But what that program did is it opened my eyes to like federal law enforcement and the various areas of federal law enforcement. There's just so many different places that one can serve. And so I think if anything, and I didn't end up going into, law enforcement, but at that time it cemented like, okay, if this military thing doesn't work out, that's what you need to point your life toward. And so, yeah, it was such a great experience for me.
So going into that program, you enlist, is there any opportunity to select for what you're going to do when you're actually commissioned, or is that all done afterwards?
Yeah, I don't know how the other services do this, but the Marine Corps, everything needs of the Marine Corps, right? Like that's the saying, right? Needs of the Marine Corps. If you have a law contract, so you're an attorney, or an air contract, you're going in as a pilot. You've already done all the testing and you qualify to be a pilot. Those are the only two MOS's, military occupational specialties, that you can select for. The way the Marine Corps does it, you go to officer candidate school, and then there is a 6-month-long school called the Basic Officer Course, TBS, also in Quantico. And every Marine officer goes there. Every second lieutenant attends that school. So it doesn't matter what school you graduated from, what college you graduated from. None of that matters. You all go to the same place. And over that 6 months, you learn, in theory, you learn how to be a Marine officer. So you get basic knowledge on weapon systems and strategy and tactics and communication systems and all the different functions of the Marine Corps, the different, structures, and then learning how to wear uniforms, all that, right? All that's taught during that 6 months. And you also test a lot during that 6 months. And so at the end of that, or right toward the end of that, probably a month before it's over, the officers who run that program get together and they go in a room. And I don't know what the math looks like on there, but they have, they know how many lieutenants they have and how many occupational specialties they need to fill. And somehow they haggle. So you're with the same, 2 captains the whole time you're at that school, and they all come together then. And I think we had 4 platoons. So that would have been, I guess 8 captains, got together and just started working through it. So based on your scores, based on your testing, based on what they call the leadership score, I put that in air quotes because leadership score means it's whatever they want it to be, right? And that's kind of the catch-all. And so that's actually a big part of that. And then they assign your job to you. You have the opportunity to pick your top 3 choices. And really the only person that gets to decide is the top graduate of the class. Everyone else is kind of at the mercy of the Marine Corps. And this is kind of wonky, but the Marine Corps has what they call quality spread. So I don't know if you're familiar with how that works, but so they break up, everyone scores, right? So everyone has a score in that class and they put you into thirds. So number 1, number 2, and number 3 are the top of each third. Then number, whatever that is, 4, 5, and 6 are number 2, So what you end up with is this, what they call quality spread. So it's not like 1 through the end. It's, you got a group of, good and not so good all the way down, right? So when they break up the MOSs, they also break it up according to quality spread. And the idea is you don't end up with one MOS or one job that has the top performers from their class. But it's this crazy situation because you can be at the bottom third, but being in the top of the bottom is better than being in the bottom of the top, right? So it's this crazy situation. So again, I don't know how all the math works exactly, but you put in your top 3 choices and then some get them and some don't. And
what were your top 3?
My top were, I had 1, which was infantry. Again, in my mind, if you're a Marine, you're an infantry Marine, that's the job, right? And so I remember sitting down with the staff officer who was responsible for me. And he said, you only put 1 down, you have to put 3 down. I'm like, sir, I don't care. Like, if I can't be an infantry officer, then it doesn't matter to me. I didn't come here to be a supply officer or a logistics officer. Nothing wrong with those guys. And they're amazing, right? You need them. But that's not why I came here. And he said, you have to pick something else.
Right, so infantry, 3
you have to. So I'm like, well, if it's not infantry, I don't care. He's like, then put some other combat arms, MOS. So I think I put tanks and something else, right? Probably artillery. I don't know. And but I said, sir, if I can't be an infantry officer, then it really doesn't matter. Just plug me into a job. And I remember his words. This is Captain Thomas. I don't know what happened to Captain Thomas, but he said, Lieutenant Stalnecker, you need to be careful what you ask for because you just might get it. And sure enough, and I was not in the top of any of those thirds. I just kind of struggled through that school, but sure enough, I got the infantry MOS and got orders to Camp Pendleton.
So went far from home.
Yeah. Went right down the street. I was trying to get away.
You could have gone to 29 Palms.
I actually asked for 29 Palms. I mean, this is what my brain was like at that time, right? It's like, okay, I want to be an infantry Marine. I don't care about anything else. And it seems to me like the most infantry probably happens in the desert. So send me out to 29 Palms. That was my number 1 choice. It was 29 Palms, Camp Pendleton, and then I think Hawaii probably. I got the infantry slot and they sent me to Camp Pendleton, which again, in my story, my personal story was, that's exactly where I needed to be, the best place I possibly could have been. Yeah. So I finished that 6-month school, went to my MOS school, which was infantry officer course right across the street. I spent so much time in Quantico. I hate the whole state of Virginia. I spent so much time there and long enough that I got snowed on, rained on, it got hot. We got ticks, like all of the seasons. Right. And we were in the woods the whole time. But I went to that school and then came back out to California.
So what year were you back in California and assigned to your first unit?
2000. Yeah, 2000. Yeah, well, I guess it would have been the beginning of 2001. Yeah, beginning of 2000. I'm trying to think. Beginning of 2001 is when we came back to, nope, that's not right. The middle of 2000. You wouldn't think that'd be a hard question, right? I told you I was in the Marine Corps, right? Math's not our strong suit. I came back to California. I think I checked in. I must have been July of 2000 is when I checked in. Yeah.
Once you finally got there, and obviously there's a lot for you to learn.
Yeah.
But you're actually in it. Going back to being that kid at 14 years old, I want to be in the Marine Corps. Was it everything you thought it would be?
Man, it was. So there's a lot to that. Okay, first of all, since I was like 15 years old, I had this speech worked out for the first time I'd stand in front of a platoon, right? So this wasn't like an off-the-cuff thing. Like, I was ready. Then I went to college. Then I went to the schools. I did all the stuff. And now I'm standing in front of my first rifle platoon, 40 Marines. And I'm introduced, and I had the opportunity to step in front of them, and I've got the speech ready. And I looked at those guys, and I don't even know how to describe it other than I was just so overwhelmed with the moment. It literally was the pinnacle of this thing, this mountain I had been climbing since I was a teenager. And I remember looking at them and just completely blanking, and then saying a few things, and then handing the platoon back over to, it was our guide as a sergeant. And that was it. And he came up to me afterwards like, sir, can I talk to you for a second? Sure. He's like, yeah, that wasn't good. That was not good what happened back there. And I said, yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. But man, it was amazing. And I was in 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. I've come to understand this. And you don't realize this, particularly when you're young. You think that what you're going through is just how it is everywhere. I know there are bad units in the Marine Corps. I know that. I know there are bad leaders in the Marine Corps. I know that. But I was not in a place where either of those things were true. I tell the story often about Staff Sergeant Zapata, who retired as Sergeant Major Zapata. Absolutely incredible Marine, school-trained scout sniper, just amazing Marine. He was our platoon sergeant. He was my platoon sergeant when I checked in. So 2nd lieutenant, all I know is what I learned in school. I had no real idea. I had a lot of the tactics and the strategy stuff and the employment stuff figured out, but not how to lead Marines. And I learned how to be a Marine officer from, at the time, Staff Sergeant Zapata. He was an incredible leader. He was very clear-minded. He was strong. He knew what to do and how to do it. And he had no problem pulling me aside and saying, hey, sir, like there's kind of a joke in the military. If you hear a, hey, sir, that's not a term of respect. That's like something negative's coming, right? And he was always very respectful, but very clear, like, this is how this needs to be done. And so, man, I had him. And then my company commander at the time was Captain Cal Worth, who now is the division commander for 3rd Marine Division. He's a 2-star general. I mean, he's unbelievable. That was my company commander, right? So I always joke he's like kind of my dad in the Marine Corps. I checked in as a 2nd lieutenant. He was my direct report, my boss, and he spent so much time with me and the other lieutenants in our company. Our battalion commander when I went to Iraq was Fred Padilla, who retired as a 2-star general. Our regimental commander when we went to Iraq was Joe Dunford, who became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Our division commander was General James Mattis, which, love him or hate him, he's a war fighter. That was my chain of command. Those were the people I was being taught by. And then the other lieutenants, the staff NCOs, the Marines I was around, absolutely incredible leaders. So long answer to your question, but yeah, it was everything I expected it to be and more. I didn't appreciate that in the moment. I just assumed this is what being a Marine is all about. And it should be. And that was definitely the standard, but it was amazing. Yeah, it was amazing.
I remember as a kid growing up, because my dad served in the Army, non-com sergeant, but the stories that I've heard, and I've heard this many times in various forms, but a good new young officer understands that they need to grab onto their senior enlisteds and basically say, show me the ropes.
Yeah.
Is that something that was taught to you, or did you find that you gravitated towards that naturally?
That is definitely part of the process, the ethos, if you will, of the Marine Corps. when you go through those schools, you go through the basic officer course, every Marine lieutenant is there. It's a hodgepodge. There are officers who are responsible for evaluation and a lot of the instruction, but most of the instruction is done by NCOs and staff NCOs. Went over to infantry officer course. Again, it's captains who essentially run the program, but the ones teaching the programs, the ones teaching the classes, the ones taking the lieutenants through all the things they need to know are all staff NCOs and NCOs. And it is also spoken. So it's demonstrated, but it's also spoken. You need to find a good staff NCO. You need to trust your NCOs. They've been around longer than you have. They know things that you don't know. They have experiences you don't have, and you need to trust them. So that is definitely built into the process. But then I checked into that unit, and Staff Sergeant Zapata was so squared away. He had just come off the drill field. And so he had, kind of that still was his mindset. He had to work through that, but still his mindset. But he was so good at what he did, and the Marines respected him so well, so much, that knowing what I knew, having been told what I was told, find a good staff NCO, and then I've got this guy who's my platoon sergeant, it just made absolute sense. Again, thankfully, coming through sports and all the things I did growing up, you're always taught to ask questions, to learn, to grow, and it just made sense. I've seen a lot of officers who didn't respect that process, didn't respect the people who do have the answers, and it never works out well for them. They expose themselves, and it puts them and the people they lead in a very, very bad situation. And so, yeah, thankfully, again, it was taught, it was demonstrated, but then I had the right person. Staff Sergeant Zapata, so when I checked in, again, took me a while to figure it out, but July of 2000, I didn't end up in Iraq until 2003. And there was a weird kind of shakeup of personnel. So Staff Sergeant Zapata, who got promoted in that process to gunny, should have been moved out of our battalion, but wasn't. He was moved over to take care of our scout sniper platoon because he was one of the very few school-trained scout sniper staff NCOs. So he was my platoon sergeant for almost 2 years. And when we ended up in Iraq, he would regularly come and find me, or I would go find him wherever he was if I had questions or just something I needed to bounce off somebody or whatever. So now I have a lot of experience. We've done a lot of stuff. We're in this environment, but he was so good at building a relationship with me. And at the time I would have said I built it with him, but he built it with me in a trust that he continued to mentor me throughout my time, even in combat. And so incredible blessing in my life.
You already mentioned that going in and when you selected where you were going to be stationed, you kind of already foresaw the desert, the first couple Gulf Wars.
Yep.
Obviously 9/11 happens. You're in San Diego. My first question to that is, how quickly or how differently did things immediately change after that?
Yeah, it was, from one moment to the next, it changed immediately. So I came out of, peacetime military, or I was in a peacetime Marine Corps. And yes, my paradigm for like combat would have been Desert Storm, in the early 90s. And so that's kind of how I envisioned all of that, but it's peacetime training. And so what that means practically is you train, you pretend a lot, you don't get a lot of ammunition, you do the best you can with what you have. And then maybe once a year you have a big training exercise where you get to use a lot of real rounds in a place like 29 Palms, right? And it's this big training package, but the rest of your time is spent like figuring out how to get guys back from, whatever jail they got thrown into over the weekend for drinking. And, it's a lot of that kind of stuff. And then you're doing some training
Marines
and some other things. Yeah, no, not at all. And so you're doing a lot of that, right? And then you're training when you can, but it's never, you train hard, you train a lot, but it's never fully what it should be or could be, right? So 9/11 happens. I was actually on the rifle range. Got the announcement, 9/11 happens, and immediately everything changed. Within a couple of days, our battalion was tasked with deploying to Tajikistan, which is on the border of Afghanistan. And we know this looking back, but special operations units were dropped into Afghanistan at the beginning of, what became the war in Afghanistan, right? And so we were going to be there as basically a security unit. They had stuff they needed to get into the country, and we were going to be there to secure it. We got picked for that responsibility, which at the time, I mean, that was as good as it got for a Marine battalion. So that happened within a couple of days. That meant that we, within like a week, got different uniforms. How much ammunition do you want? What kind of ammunition do you want? I was at that time responsible for what we call the counter-mechanized platoon, which is all the heavy machine guns, TOWs. I had 84 Marines. I had 18 of my own vehicles. I had all the big guns. I had javelins, which was a new system that had been fielded. How much do you want? You can train as much as you want, wherever you want. And that mission didn't end up going off. But yeah, everything changed. The footing changed for the entire Marine Corps within, I would say within hours probably, but practically the way we functioned within a couple of days. Yeah.
For you personally, with that flip of the switch and the idea of war, not that it wasn't ever potentially real, but now knowing that you're going to be leading young Marines into combat, what was that like for you internally?
Again, you don't know what you don't know, but at the time, for me, that was like getting called up to the big game. Like, you know, you're in the minors, you've been in the minors for a long time, and somebody got hurt, and now you're going to play your first major league game. I mean, that's what it was like, and it was like that for all of us. It was a crazy time because we were kind of at the end of a cycle. So a lot of the Marines in the battalion were getting ready. Their EAS, their end of active service was coming up. So they got stop-lossed. So I got a lot of angry Marines, right? They were supposed to get out, but now they can't. But things started changing because when you're going to war, everyone gets very serious and starts taking the training and all the rest of it seriously. So even those Marines who were angry at first that they weren't getting out, they came around really quickly, right? And so now they're the senior guys and they need to lead. I would say not just for me, but for all of the Marines that I knew, certainly the officers and staff NCOs. It sounds strange to say it, particularly to people that haven't been in the military, but it was like the fulfillment of every dream that we had. You don't go into the Marine Corps, you don't end up in the infantry because you want to avoid going into combat. And this was an opportunity for us to do what all of us had always wanted to do. Yeah.
When you did find yourself finally in combat, what was that like for you?
Yeah, man, it's my mom, before I went to Iraq, we went to Kuwait first. So we were part of the initial push into Iraq. So we were in Kuwait. And my mom pulled me aside before it all started, before I left. And she said, "Hey, I just need to know, as your mom, I just need to know, do you really believe in the reason you're going? Do you really believe in the importance of this?" And I was like so arrogant. You know, I was so young and so arrogant. I was like, whatever I was, 23 years old, 24 years old. And I gave her that kind of like Marine officer talk, right, speech, like, it doesn't matter. You know, we're an arm of diplomacy and we're there to do the job we're called on to do, whatever. And I will never forget, we went in the middle of the night, breached the berm. We're the first Marine Infantry Battalion into the country of Iraq. The tracers are now coming our direction. I mean, I'd seen him go the other way a lot, but I'd never seen him come back my direction. I will never forget hearing my mom's voice in my head saying, "Do you really believe in the reason you're here?" It becomes really important in that moment to know that you're there for the reason you thought you were. And, you know, I have a lot of time now that I've been able to reflect on that. I have different opinions now than I did then. But in the moment, I thought we were there for the right reason. And what I knew was that the Marines I was with had been trained right. I had been with that particular unit, that platoon, for over 2 years. We had trained a lot. And I knew we were going to do what we were there to do. So it's funny. I was never afraid in those moments.
You're fine.
Break the microphone.
Don't worry about it.
I was never afraid in those moments. Certainly anxiety and a lot of those emotions come up, but I was always so confident in our ability to do what we were there to do.
How many total combat deployments did you end up doing?
1 combat deployment. Yeah, that was it. And then I got out of the Marine Corps. So I came back from Iraq, and then literally a month later, I was out of the Marine Corps.
For you, was there never a thought of making it a career?
Yeah, there was. And that's kind of a long story, but for me, I had gone through a peacetime Marine Corps, and it's very frustrating. And it really is a frustrating environment to be in as an infantry guy, because you deal with so many disciplinary issues and you deal with so much what we call garrison, right? Like, you know, Marines at home, and you give 18, 19-year-old kids money and opportunity, and very little supervision, and there's going to be problems. And so there are. So you're managing a lot of those problems. You're training, but it's a struggle. And so I had lived through that. We were supposed to go to Tajikistan, as I mentioned. We spun up for it. We trained every day for almost 3 months. And then at the last minute, got pulled off that mission and told we're going to go to a MEU. We're going to go to the 31st MEU to Okinawa to sit there. And so my opportunity to go to combat was over. The war in Afghanistan at the time, that was all that was happening, was going to be over quick because, again, my paradigm is, Desert Storm. It's going to be over quick. So I missed my opportunity to go to combat. So even though I had always wanted to be a Marine officer for life, I looked at my family. I had 2 young kids. I spent most of my time away from them training. And I looked into the future and just thought, I don't want to keep doing this peacetime thing anymore. It's just like you're spinning your wheels all the time. And so I put in my package to get out. We were headed as a battalion to Okinawa. We had Marines there getting ready. We were getting ready to go to the airport. That mission switched at the last minute, and we ended up going to Kuwait and then into Iraq. So at that point, I had already put in all of my paperwork to get out. Yeah. So that was my plan. And then while I was in Iraq, we had a good deployment. A lot of crazy things happened, and we did well. And I had people that I really respected come back to me and say, hey, getting ready to pick up captain, which I did. And you're one of the few at this point, it was 2003, one of the few company grade Marine officers who have combat experience, particularly like this. And basically your world is open. So why don't you stay in? We'll help you retract what you've already done. We'll get you orders. And I just really felt in that moment at that time, like I've already committed some other things. I need to do that. So had I known before I submitted my paperwork to get out that we were going to end up in Iraq, I probably would have done something different. But the timing is what it is.
And you mentioned that a large reason for your decision was the impact that it was having on your family. And you were starting to see your separation from your family.
Yeah.
But had Iraq or the prolonged aspect of war been more apparent to you at that time, do you think you would have stayed in?
I would have stayed in. I again, I was in Iraq when President Bush said, mission accomplished or whatever, that famous statement, right? We went into Baghdad. That was our final fight was in Baghdad on April 10th, the Battle of Baghdad. 12-hour firefight. We had over 100 casualties. Most wounded in action, not killed in action. We had some KIA, but most wounded in action. It was an incredible thing, right? So that's the last event of my combat time. And then there was not another shot fired for the 2 weeks we were still there. So that happened. Fought our way to our objective. Went running through the town. I mean, it's a crazy thing, as you can imagine. And then essentially the war ended. Like as fast as it started, it ended. And we were now doing foot patrols in town. We were doing a lot of medical stuff with the people that lived there. And so the thinking at the time was, this is it. So we came here, we got to Baghdad. Saddam's gone. His sons are gone. In fact, we were living in his sons' houses in the Al-Azamaya Palace. So there's going to be a handoff. This thing's going to be a transition now, but the war is over. And so, I don't think I was alone in believing that this is it. We did a good job and no one else is going to be hurt. And so had I known that the war was going to continue, and you can't know that, but had I known that, I certainly would have stayed in. And in fact, I got out, took a ministry job of all things, started working at a church. And 7 months after I took that job or started that job, my battalion deployed back to Iraq and was a part of the first Battle of Fallujah. And I started to hear about some of the Marines I served with being killed and other things happening. And that was a very, very difficult time for me. So hindsight, I would have definitely stayed in if I had known.
You already mentioned that you took a ministry job, but when you knew you were getting out, was there anything on your radar? Was there a plan for you after the Marine Corps?
That was, and that was the reason I followed through on getting out of the Marine Corps. Again, considering all things, the church community that my family and I were part of, California's home for us. So it was an opportunity to kind of stay there. I had 2 young kids, a wife that's way better than I should have, right? And I knew that even then. This was going to add a lot of stability to our lives. there was not going to be another combat deployment in my future. So it made sense to transition. So I talked to, my pastor, who said, hey, if you ever get out of the Marine Corps, I'll have a job for you here. I have a criminal justice degree. I don't have a Bible degree, but we have projects to manage. We have a lot of other things that your leadership experience can help with. And so I'll have a place for you. And I'd committed to that when I thought I was going to Okinawa. But my wife had, gone through the process of finding us a house. And so we were starting to put roots in place, and then went to Iraq and all those things happened, but I was already pretty committed. And for my wife and my family, it was a nice thought that this is where we're going to be, and this is where we're going to stay, and this is where we're going to raise our family. And so, all of those were definitely a factor for sure.
So were you not going towards ministry per se? You were going back to your church and the job as basically a project manager?
Doing whatever they needed me to do. So having grown up in a ministry world, my dad being a pastor, I knew that, I understood that world. I didn't know where that was going to take me. I didn't see that as like a long-term thing per se. I never thought that deeply into it. I just saw it as a good place to land after the military. It's a job that I can do around people that I know care about me, in a place that I care about, and we'll see what happens after that. And so that was kind of the whole plan. I wouldn't say I had a heart for ministry. People talk about a heart for ministry, right? Meaning a real desire to serve others. And that wasn't really where I was at that time. But that was a great place for me to go after the Marine Corps and then figure out what came next.
When you first transitioned out, I know you've already mentioned that once your previous team and platoon had started deploying to Fallujah, you started hearing the stories back, and that was a tough. But you had that period of 6 or 7 months. How was that initial transition out
terrible
for you?
Yeah, it was terrible. My whole life had been pointed toward being a Marine, and again, it's easier to see this in retrospect than it was in the moment. But my whole world, my whole life, my whole identity was wrapped up in that uniform, that job. And then, for me, the pinnacle of military service is leading Marines in combat. And I did that. And I did a good job and was recognized for doing a good job. I mean, everyone there did a good job. I wasn't alone in that, but we trained, we executed, we did a great job. I brought those Marines home. And then I put the uniform away, and I fell into this. So I'm leading Marines in combat, and then a month later, I'm working with volunteers at a church, trying to get things done. I knew how to function in an infantry unit, but when I'm sitting in a church staff meeting and one of the other staff members says something stupid and I call it out, right? I thought like, okay, well, like yelling worked over there. It probably works here. And, for those who aren't part of church world, life in the infantry unit is not the same. And so that was a problem. And I became extremely frustrated, very short with people. I had no real idea how to function in that environment, even though I kind of grew up in it. My head and my heart were still like Marine Corps mode. I started to say things like, people don't know who I am or where I've come from or what I've done, which I wasn't a big deal, but I was a big deal in my mind at that time. And on the planet, there weren't that many people that had been in combat, Americans who had been in Iraq or Afghanistan. There were some, obviously, but it wasn't like it was 20 years later where if you're in the military, you deploy, right? It was a unique situation. And I had a problem with authority. I had a problem with the expectations that were placed on me. Became extremely disruptive in my work environment at the church, which is silly. Like, it's kind of funny just to think about. But then at home, I was also extremely frustrated. I get very angry. I took everything out on my wife and my two little kids. And my kids at the time were like 3 and 4 years old. I would throw things, I would break things, I was screaming all the time. The fact that my wife stayed with me through that, we've been married almost 26 years, but at that time we'd been married a few years, we had 2 little kids. The fact that she stayed with me through that period of time is a testament to her, not to anything else. And, I say that all the time. she should have probably walked away. She probably should have left. I never hit her or the kids, but I did everything just short of that. I was a disaster. And so that process was very, very hard for me. And, even the Fallujah thing, I remember sitting in a staff meeting, and I just, one of the Marines I had served with was emailing me. And he had access to email, which we didn't when we were there, but he had access to that. And he would tell me once in a while when something happened, when a Marine that I knew was killed and things like that. And, Fallujah kicks off. I'm hearing about these Marines that I had served with. I was their platoon commander. I had taken care of them. When I deployed with them, they were like 18 years old. And now they're there and I'm not. And I'm in this very kind of sterile ministry environment. And I remember like trying to communicate that to the people I was working with, who I still know today. We're very good friends with them. But at the time, right? Like, yeah, man, I just heard that this happened and that happened and these guys died. And they had no idea how to deal with that. They didn't. And it wasn't fair to expect them to know how to deal with it. But they listened. And then it was like, okay, well, let's move on with this meeting. We have an agenda. We got things we need to do. That just crushed me, It was just like, I should be there with them. I told them I would take care of them. And I'm here doing this stupid stuff. And it wasn't stupid. It wasn't unimportant. In fact, it's what I got paid to do. But it just seemed so unimportant in those moments.
We're going to take a quick break from the conversation. First, thank you for your continued support. Second, I appreciate the fact that you've made it to this point in the conversation, but I still need more help. If you would, if you're not already, please follow, subscribe on whatever platform you're getting the podcast. If you could leave me a rating, leave me a comment or a thumbs up. And last, if you could share this, either this episode or the podcast, with anybody that you think might benefit from it, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you again. Let's get back into the conversation.
I was very, very frustrated, and that just got worse over time, to the point that about 11 or 12 months after I started that job, that pastor who had been our pastor before that called me into his office and he said, "Hey man, like, first of all, this is 2003. No one's talking about trauma or post-traumatic stress or anything. That's not a conversation anyone's having." So he calls me into his office and said, "Look, I love you. I love your family, but this is not working. You are completely disruptive here. You're not helping. You're just creating chaos. You need to figure out what's going on. You either need to go somewhere else or figure this thing out. I'm here to help. I don't know how to help, but this is not working the way it is." And he was the first one really to confront me on that. I mean, my wife, obviously in the midst of me being, a psycho, would say things, but he was the first one really to confront me on that. He told me to take the next week, like, "You're off next week. Go somewhere. Talk to your wife." And doing the work that I do now, I see this more clearly, but when I left the Marine Corps, I started that job and kept going. I never stopped to talk to anyone. I never had a conversation about what we had done or where we had been or what I felt or none of those things. And so it was a year later when he said, "Go take a week and figure this out," that I was able to actually talk to my wife. And we dropped our kids off, went off together for a week and mostly just talked. And I realized, yeah, I'm kind of the idiot in this situation, not everybody else, right? And that began a long process. I used to say it took me a year to get my feet back under me. My wife interrupted me. We were speaking in front of a big crowd at a marriage conference last year. And she stopped me when I said it took me a year to get my feet back under me. She said, "It took you about 10 years to get your feet back under you." I'm like, "Thank you." What am I supposed to do? Like, there's a lot of couples watching, right? We can't fight right now. But that was the truth. But that was the beginning of it though. That was, being confronted, beginning to take responsibility, take some steps forward. And it took me a long time to really get to the place where I was fully responsible. But that's what started it. So yeah, a very difficult transition. I think there were a lot of reasons for that.
Well, just from me being the outsider looking in and listening to your talk, I often say this, and one of the reasons why I started this podcast is these jobs are great. These careers are great. I have no doubt that everybody who comes to them enjoys them. I enjoyed the 30 plus years that I gave towards law enforcement. Yeah. The same people who give their time to military service, I get it, but you can't make these your identity. But on the flip side of that, you were a young man who at 14 or 15 years old said, that's where I want to be.
Right.
And then you got there, and if I'm interpreting it correctly, you didn't leave when you felt the game was over.
Yeah.
It kind of got taken away from you a little bit. And you addressed one of the things that I do like to talk about with this is that balance of service and family.
Yeah.
Because for many as a law enforcement officer, those of us who are not in the federal system, I got plenty of friends who are marshals, FBI, they have that sense of, man, tomorrow my family might be uprooted and we might move from, Illinois to Arizona.
Yeah.
You've got that. But for the most of us, we go to work each day, we come home.
Sure.
Military, you're deployed and deployed and deployed and it impacts your family. So it's hard to find that balance for that 20 or 30 year career.
Yeah. And, I've talked to a lot of people since then about exactly that. I just wasn't mature enough, and I didn't have anyone, I don't think, helping me understand how to balance that. So, as an infantry guy, I was either training, and I would train, Tuesday through Friday or Monday through Thursday, most weeks. Every once in a while you wouldn't. I'd be home for the weekends, or off for a month training or on a deployment. And, I did Okinawa deployment, did combat deployment. What I understand now is what your family really wants from you, particularly a military family. Most of them, they may not fully understand, but they kind of know what they're getting into. They're fine with you doing your job when you need to do your job. I think most of them, they may not love it, but they're okay with you being deployed when you have to be deployed or training when you have to be training. What they're not okay with is you not paying attention to them when you're not training or not gone or not deployed. I didn't understand that. And so, I've talked to a lot of people who are like, well, because of my deployments, because of this, because of that, because I'm work so much, my family hates me. No, they probably don't like you because even when you're home, you're not home. Because when you're home, you're not focused on them because you're not taking care of what you need to. And I think it's maturity that allows someone to have a long career in law enforcement, a long career in the military, and have a strong marriage and, have good kids. And it's maturity that allows that to happen, being focused at work, being focused at home. So yeah, that's a major issue for sure.
And one of the things to throw us under the bus is that in those 20 or 30 years, unfortunately, there's a selfish side to it.
Sure. Yeah.
And deployments, as odd as it sounds, are fun.
Yep.
Call outs from the law enforcement side. When you're getting that call at 2:00 in the morning, there's a little bit of it that's fun, or working extended overtime. There's the fun aspect, and the maturity comes in balancing that also.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Well, and, this is while the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were, 20 years, they're going on. I talked to so many guys who were like, I'd come home from a deployment and they'd ask for, one sergeant, one staff sergeant, one whatever, to go on this next deployment. I'd sign up because I just have to be there. Well, yeah, but you have a family, right? And so, it's maturity that says, it is exciting. I do like that. I feel super engaged and focused and all those things when I'm doing my job. But my family is paying for that. And so there has to be a balance in that. Do your job when you need to do it. Sometimes you have to volunteer, but don't leave your family behind. And the people who figure that out are the ones who really do well.
So for you, that week-long kind of getaway, was that enough of a reset for you?
It was only enough of a reset as a starting point. So I guess reset, but it was a starting point. It was the first time, honestly, I in that year, I looked at myself and said, oh, I guess I'm the problem. It's not everybody else. I'm blaming everyone else. That was the first time I had the thought, like, how in the world should these people, whether it's the people I work with or my family or whoever, how in the world should these people know what it's like to come home from combat in Iraq? They love me and they care about me, but they can't understand that. That's not their fault that they don't understand that. Veterans say this all the time. Well, they don't get me or they don't understand me. Well, how should they understand you, right? They don't have that experience, just like you don't have their experience, by the way. And so that was the first time I had that thought. It was the first time I had to look around and say, the fact that I'm, this frustrated and this angry, the way I'm acting is just not okay. There's never an excuse for this kind of bad behavior. There may be reasons, and I didn't understand the reasons at the time. There may be reasons, but it's not okay for me to treat my wife this way. It's not okay for me to treat my kids this way. It's not okay for me to treat the people I work with this way. And that week gave me, I think, the space. My wife and I we were living in Oceanside here in Southern California. We drove up the coast to San Francisco. And so we were in the car a lot that week. We talked a lot that week. And yeah, it gave me the space to really start to see things, I think, more clearly, that it wasn't all about me.
In the worst part of that time, were you recognizing your bad behavior, or were you kind of ignoring the elephant in the room?
Yeah, I would just bear down on it. It's not my fault. If the kids would do better, this is just how I need to respond because I'm their dad. My anger was never my fault. It was always because somebody else did something. And then in my workplace, again, it's a church, right? But there, you have people who are pretty dedicated to what they're doing. They could be doing something else. They're doing that. And they're idiots. They're stupid. They're not capable. Those are all things that are not true. They're not factually accurate. But yeah, my response was always someone else's fault. And that's, I think, at the end of that year, and being confronted, and then, my dad spoke a lot of truth into my life, and then I started to hear my wife, who I'm sure had been talking. I was able to really get a hold of that. Yeah, these are all good people, and kids act like kids, and, my wife is amazing, and the people I work with are pretty devoted and dedicated. I'm behaving this way because of me, not because of them.
Did you ever end up actually going all the way to the point of talking to somebody professionally?
Well, I did, but it took me about 15 years, and I should have talked to someone a lot sooner. That 10-year process did not need to be a 10-year process. If I had been humble enough, and this is something that took me a long time to learn, but if I had been humble enough to not only acknowledge that I had a problem, which I did, but to acknowledge that I didn't know how to fight my way out of the problem, my response was to read more, learn more, try to understand better, do better in the work that I was doing, just try harder. And that helped me to move forward in a lot of areas, but it still caused, my wife 5 years later to pack the kids up, and she put them in the car. She didn't leave, but we had those kind of problems for a long time. And a big part of that was because it took me so long to sit down and actually talk to somebody who could help me.
I want to go towards the work you're doing today with Mighty Oaks, but I want to stay on this. And where I want to go with it was in conjunction with when Mighty Oaks started, or what prompted you to get going with that and actually going and seeking professional assistance. Were they in line with each other, or was the going to talk to somebody professionally is what kind of the catalyst for Mighty Oaks, or vice versa?
Yeah, I would like to say that was the case. I didn't talk to anyone professionally until after I was involved with Mighty Oaks. Part of my thing, was that if you had asked me in 2003, if you had asked me in the 10 years following that, if post-traumatic stress, combat trauma, these things, if they were real, I would have said no and meant it. It wasn't, I wasn't faking. I would have said, no. People go to combat and they do fine. But there are weak people and people struggle. How I didn't equate kind of what I was dealing with all of that is weird, but I just didn't think it was a real thing. I thought it was just kind of like, no, that's psychologists talk about that or whatever, but it's made up.
Isn't that a failure of each of us, though, letting our ego get in the way and think that it's always somebody, it's not happening to me, it's just happening 100%. To somebody else.
100%. 100%. And if someone asked me, what's the first step to getting better? I would start right there. you need to understand you're not unique in this, right? I always say you're not special. You know, people love you, you know, hopefully your family loves you and God loves you, right? But you're not special in the sense that this is not unique to you. Your struggles, they're yours. No one can feel the way you do, but other people have been through things like this. And that's where you have to start. But for me, it was like, well, my thing that I just dealt with and that I'm dealing with, that I'm walking through, my wife and I have, you know, some challenges, and maybe if she was a little bit different, if I was a little bit different, I just get angry, you know, or whatever. That was unique to me. I was so blind to the fact that like, this is a thing that people struggle with. And so part of me moving forward during that first year, you know, after I had that conversation with my wife and, you know, my pastor, and started to put some pieces in place. Part of me moving forward was turning my back on the military. So I never kept in touch with people that I served with. I never went to reunions or, you know, meetups or anything like that. I just walked away from all of it. And part of that was, I can't keep looking over my shoulder. I can't keep saying, I wish I was back there. I've got to keep moving forward. And what I'm struggling with is what I'm struggling with. I did my job. I brought those guys home. I've got this big picture hanging up in my office of my platoon in Baghdad. And you know, I look at that picture all the time, every day. And for years, I look at that picture and think, it's kind of a mission accomplished picture. We went into a country, and we were the first boots on the ground, you know, conventional military, boots on the ground. First KIA of the war was one of our lieutenants. I mean, we were there when it started, and we ended it in Baghdad, and I brought those guys home. I'm proud of that. Now I'm moving on, but I cut everybody out of my life, military people out of my life, Marines out of my life. So it was 10 years later that a Marine that I served with reached out to me and said, hey, I met this guy. He's starting this program, and he's a Marine as well, a combat guy, trying to get this thing going, and he's having a hard time because, you know, Marines are notoriously cynical, and he can't get anyone to come to this program that he's trying to start. But he will bring some of the guys from our platoon. Would you be interested in coming? This guy reached out to me through Facebook, so social media. I didn't talk to him. He just reached out to me through social media. And I said, yeah, I guess I would. I mean, it's 10 years later. I don't know why I did, but I did. And met up with, it was 9 guys from my old platoon. And a lot of time had passed, 10 years had passed. Some of them had deployed again, and some of them hadn't. But meeting up with those guys, and then I started to hear stories about those Marines in that picture, right? This picture I'd always been so proud of. I heard stories of Marines that were killed in Fallujah and in other places. I heard stories of Marines who took their own lives when they got back, stories of broken marriages and broken relationships, also some success stories as well, but mostly not. Mostly a lot of brokenness and a lot of hurt. And that was the first time in my life that I remember at least having the thought, my commitment and my service to these Marines did not end when I took that uniform off. When I put the uniform in the closet for the last time, I viewed that as the end of my military service, and then I struggled to move forward, right? Because I was hanging my identity up in the closet. But I walked away from all those guys because I thought that my job was done. But in that process of time, I had struggled and learned and grown and found some ways to move forward myself, some tools and some people. And I had a responsibility, an obligation to share that with those Marines that I had served with. Chad Robichaux, who was starting Mighty Oaks, at the time, he was trying to get it going, and he met me, and that's where we met. And he's like, hey, I'm trying to do this thing. Would you help me? Would you come along and help me write curriculum and train teachers and put this program together? And had I not had that experience of sitting with those Marines and talking to them, I would have said, no, that's for other people. Other people are doing that. But it was really impressed on me. No, there is a real problem. Those problems you've been struggling through, a lot of these people have been struggling through. And yet they don't all have the resources or the tools that you have available to help move forward. And it was probably another 5 years before I ever sat down with a counselor. I remember the first time I talked to a professional counselor. I just telling her the story. and she was recommended to me through someone else, and she was very, very kind, and I was telling her some of my combat stories and stuff, and she stopped me and she said, "You've never told anyone any of these stories." Like, well, no, I tell them all the time. I mean, I speak and I tell these stories and I do these things and I have a podcast and I wrote a book. And she's like, "No, but you've never talked about it, like, to someone who can help you. You've never talked about how it made you feel or what this has done to you and your family and all the things that I shared with her." And I hadn't. And I'd been in ministry for a long time at that point. I'd been working with Mighty Oaks and veterans for a long time at that point, but still, it took me a long time to get personally to the place where I could separate kind of my professional life from my personal life. And that was a big part of it.
I'll use the story that you told about the lieutenant that was KIA'd in Iraq.
Yeah.
For you going back to that point in your life.
Yeah.
How might you process that better if you were redoing it today?
Man, that particular moment was, that's a major event, obviously, but it's a major event in my understanding of how the world works and leadership in particular. I wrote about that in my book that I wrote about Iraq. And in that, I also talked about our battalion commander and how he handled it. And I've been so blessed, and I've had the opportunity to reconnect with so many people. And Fred Padilla, he's retired now and has been for a number of years. But I went to his retirement ceremony, and we have actually sat down and talked about Shane Childers being killed and how he handled it. Because I wrote about it in my book, and he got a copy of the book, and he read what I had written about him, right? And he told me, he said, "I sat there when I read that, and I started crying because I've always wondered if I handled it right." And when that happened, so Shane Childers was a prior enlisted Marine, and like a Marine's Marine, incredible Marine, incredible human being, a wonderful infantry officer, a lot of experience. I don't know how long he had been enlisted before he became an officer, but he had a lot of experience that he brought to the table. My platoon was sitting in a screen line, and his platoon was clearing a building behind us. Some random guys drove up in a pickup truck. This is right at the beginning of the war. We had been in the country probably for 11 hours. And they opened fire. He caught a round, 7.62 round, where his flak jacket opened. It was the old style of flak jackets, if you remember those. And it was opened. And so the round went between that, called in his own medevac. This guy was incredible, and died. And so we had been in the country for almost 3 days, hadn't slept for, that long. And we were all called to, the leadership was called to our battalion commander's vehicle to get our follow-on mission. Shane had been killed, a day and a half earlier. We had continued to do what we needed to do, and there was a lot going on. Got called to battalion commander's vehicle. And I know for me, and I think for everyone else, we expected the first thing for him to talk about would have been Shane being killed. But what he talked about was the follow-on mission and what we needed to do and kind of the order of priorities and all of those things. And then he stopped, and I asked him about this, and I wrote about it. So I wrote about it first because my perception was he looked at everyone's faces and realized he needed to say something. I asked him about that. He said, "That's right." And he looked up in the middle of giving this kind of order about what would happen next, said, "Hey, I understand what happened to Shane. I loved him just like you did. There will be a time for us to mourn his loss, but that time is not now. We have a job to do, and a lot of other people are going to lose their lives if we don't do our job right now." And I remember at the time being like so wounded by that, because you don't grow up. If someone in your life growing up is killed, the world stops so that you can deal with that. And we were just going to go on. I remember like feeling so bad about that. How could you be so cold and callous? And then we moved on, and a lot of other people were killed, and you learn how to function in that environment. What I learned from that, though, was that that's what leadership is. Leadership is understanding the environment. Leadership is understanding the right place and the time, right place and time for the things that are happening. Leadership is pushing toward the mission. It's getting a bigger picture. It's all of those things. And I did not have the ability to see that. So all I felt deeply was the loss, and there was a big loss, but I failed to see the bigger picture in that. And had I known then what I know now and had the ability to look at that objectively, I would have handled it much, much better. I took it so personally. And, Shane was an incredible warrior. He was a war fighter. He knew what was at stake. And he wouldn't have wanted us to not continue pressing forward because of that loss. And so I would have handled that much differently if I had had the ability to look at that more objectively. Thankfully, I've had the ability to talk about it and write about it and process it. But huge, huge lesson for me. Huge lesson for me.
And that is unfortunately one of the double-edged swords with the careers that we've chosen.
100%.
Because unfortunately, there are times where as a leader, as an organization, as a team, whatever you want to refer to it as, the world's not going to stop for us.
That's right.
We have to keep pressing forward because if we stop and fixate on this one tragedy, others are going to get harmed.
That's exactly right.
The catch-22 in that, though, is where good leadership has to come in is when there is a point when you can take a knee, make sure that you don't forget to do that.
Right. That's right.
You can't just keep pushing forward to where all of it gets, I don't want to say forgotten, but just like anything else, you get enough water under the bridge and it just gets forgotten about.
Yeah. And it's been a long time now. When we got back to Camp Pendleton, huge service for not just Shane, but the other Marines that were killed then as well. The ability on a yearly basis to talk about him and write about him and people post about him. And that time did come and people took it very, very seriously, including our battalion commander. He just understood the space that we were operating in and got exactly what you just said. This doesn't mean we're not going to take the time to do that. And he definitely did. And he led that. But he led it at the right time. And the youth and immaturity, you think you know everything, you've got to figure it out. And thankfully, you have the right people around you who can carry you forward and help you see things better. And that was one of those moments for sure.
And a little cliche-ish, but obviously the higher you promote, the higher on the rungs of that ladder you are to where you're seeing more heads, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's, in a weird way, it gets a little easier to not fixate on one because you see so many more.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. And, it's funny. Before we went into Iraq, General Mattis was saying there will probably be, the course of this war, and we didn't know what we didn't know, 30,000 casualties. Like, that's crazy. That's crazy. But he was at a level where he could look at that and come to the conclusion, based on whatever math that was, that that's acceptable. Now, casualties don't mean KIA. That means people who are wounded, and it means a lot of different things. But that was acceptable. Well, at my level, I remember the first time I saw a Marine get shot, and it didn't kill him. He was fine. But like that, like everything stops. Like, don't do anything else. We got to take care of this. And, again, you move quickly through that, but we're clearing these little bunkers in the area that we were in. And I wanted to stop everything to deal with that. And Marines are like, sir, we got people to do that. That's not you. We've got a process, right? And I knew that. It wasn't like I got super hung up on that, but yeah, your first response is stop everything. So it is funny as you go up in leadership, how you have to just make hard decisions and see things a little bit differently, but try not to be too detached from what's actually happening too.
The other thing that's frustrating for both sides of our houses is inevitably in any engagement, we are going to more than likely be the better trained element against our adversary.
Sure.
More than likely better armed element than our adversary.
Yeah.
And yet it's that damn one lucky stupid shot.
That's it.
He found the hole in the flak vest. We end up taking him just under the armpit where it just the law of averages is definitely against us.
It's crazy. That's one of the weird images I have in my mind from Iraq is those guys drove by on a pickup truck, took a shot with an AK-47. Terrible shot with an AK-47. First of all, it's not a great platform, but all those things considered, to your point, I don't know what the distance was. It was pretty far. So one of these weird pictures or images in my mind is of those guys hanging out the window dead, because then you had a whole platoon engage them. So they got a couple shots off, but one found its way into Shane's chest. And yeah, it's so crazy. And so you can't, on a practical side, tactically, you can't take anything for granted. You have to be very, very careful and very focused. Yeah, it's rarely the guy who knows what he's doing that gets you. It's the one who just puts the gun up over his head and takes a shot and it lands.
For you, and let's go to the marketing side of the house. What's the title of your book? Where can people find it?
Yep. So for my stuff, the best place is just to use my name, Jeremy Stalnecker, jeremystalnecker.com. My books and connections out to my socials and all that stuff is there. I've written a few books. The book I was just talking about is called March or Die. And that's a book about our time in Iraq. And I take 13 different stories of our time in Iraq and then try to make some practical applications. So here are some lessons learned. It's not just telling the story. It's here are some lessons learned. I've written a book on leadership, a couple of other books. And then our organization has produced some resources, one on resiliency, one on post-traumatic stress disorder, and then recently just put out another book on suicide. And all of those are available for free download on our organization's website, which you can also find through jeremystalnecker.com. So yeah, we do our best to put out as many resources as possible. Understanding a lot of what we've just been talking about, people need help, that they don't always want to get the help. So we've provided books and podcasts and testimonies and videos and all kinds of other stuff for them to see.
What was the catalyst for you to want to write the first two books, or the books on combat and leadership?
Yeah. So the book on Iraq, the March or Die, I had started a blog, and I'm terrible at blogging. I get in like these moods, right, where I'll do it for 3 weeks and then I'll stop. But I started this blog and I just started to write, and this was just me processing some of these stories. Started to write some lessons learned from Iraq. In fact, I think that's what it was called, Lessons Learned from Iraq. And it was just kind of me working through it. And a lot of the Marines that I'd served with got a hold of it and kept telling me how much they appreciated it and, all of those things. And it was kind of giving a voice to a lot of us. And so I basically took those blogs and developed them into that book. And for me, stories are fun. I read a lot of history and biographies and those kind of things. But I read for the lessons. I read to understand something from it, not for entertainment. And that served as a good platform for me to do that. The leadership book was a little bit different. I came from the military. I learned how to do leadership in the Marine Corps model, which works really well. We could argue that's one of the best leadership schools in the world. But it was very type A, very heavy-handed leadership. Then I went into a ministry environment where people started talking about things like servant leadership, they would call it, and some of these other phrases they would use. And I knew that the type A thing wasn't probably the best all-around leadership model. But then I looked at this leadership model in church world, and I came to the conclusion, and this isn't great, right? But this was my conclusion at the time, that a lot of what people call servant leadership is like manipulation, but with God attached to it. So if I can get you to do what I want you to do.
Don't let John Maxwell hear you.
Yeah, right. Then I throw God on the other side of it, right? Like, oh, okay, well, I guess I have to do it. And John Maxwell is actually a great example because he doesn't do that. Like he gives the practical steps. And if you go back far enough, even in his story, they're biblical principles, a lot of them. But I looked at these two models and I'm like, this can't be all there is, and trying to understand what real leadership was. And so I wrote a leadership book called Leadership by Design, and I did it really as me working through what is real leadership. And is everyone a leader? Are there only a few people who are leaders? Is leadership something that's taught? Is it something that you're born with? What is leadership? I settled on a working definition of leadership for myself, and it was very, very helpful to me. And then produced it so that other people could get a hold of it because of just a lot of the people that I work with. But that was a journey for me. And so those two books were really just me trying to work through things on my own and then making them available to others.
The process of writing a lot of your experiences, was that helpful?
It was very helpful. Very, very helpful. Yeah, it framed a lot of things. It also causes you to be careful about what you believe. Combat stories, well, I can speak to combat stories. I know that it's true also in law enforcement when you're in a a direct action environment, right? You don't remember everything that happened. You remember what you were a part of, and even that is a little fuzzy sometimes. And there's so many emotions and so many moving parts and so much happening. And so when you tell a story or you remember a story, you're not always remembering it right. And so a big part of writing these things down for me was writing it as I remembered it, and then reaching out to other people who were also there to make sure that I had the story right, that I understood it clearly. Because we can start to build up this like narrative in our minds that's just not true. And so going through the process of writing, I encourage people to keep journals if they're struggling through traumatic experiences and things like that. That's a big part of it, is getting it out of your brain, where it just kind of rolls around and festers, and getting it onto paper. So that part was very, very helpful to me. I think it was helpful to me to then draw lessons that people could use. So it in a sense redeems those stories or those moments and allows something good to come out of them. But then it solidifies some of those lessons for me. And so many times I've gone back to the stories and the lessons learned. And that March or Die story, so the title March or Die, it comes from one event in Iraq. We had this major firefight, and it's become, that's the name of my podcast, it's become really the way that I see the world. You have two choices. You can stay where you are and die. You can make that decision, or you can march, put one foot in front of the other. So I look back to that story and I tell that story, and I've written about it, but it has really shaped the way that I view the world. And so very, very helpful to me. I think more than anything I've written, that book was really helpful to me. Yeah.
When you were going through that process where you wrote it out as you remembered it and then had somebody else basically kind of fact check it.
Yeah.
Was there ever a single story where you were just completely off of what?
None that I was completely off. There were people who would say, well, I think this happened or that happened, or there was one story. I didn't realize there was this other unit adjacent to us also engaged. And so things like that, they probably wouldn't have factually changed or functionally changed the story, but were very helpful to round it out. Things that I even didn't understand at the time they were happening, that someone else from a different perspective could explain, this is why that happened or how that happened or how I saw that. So nothing where it was like, you're lying, right? But a lot of, maybe you missed this fact or this aspect or this part of that. So that was helpful too. I remember telling that story, that March or Die story one time in a room of service members at our program. And I didn't realize, but one of the students, who I've gotten to know very well since then, but one of the students was there. He was in an adjacent unit. He was probably literally 20 feet behind me. We had pulled up on a bridge. We were firing in different directions, and he was right behind us. And so when you know that people are going to be reading or listening to, critiquing what you say, you're very careful. And that's been good for me. Yeah.
So circling back now to Mighty Oaks, because I really want to give you the opportunity to talk more about it and its entity.
Yeah.
First off, what's its mission?
Yeah. Our mission is to support those who have served our country in uniform. That could be veterans, active duty service members, first responders, or we would say spouses. And, we know so many of these issues are not specific to the person who served, but also to their families. And our goal is to serve them. Now, we focus on a very specific community of people. It is primarily people who have dealt with some degree of trauma related to their work. I say that. Often it's childhood trauma they brought into their work that was exacerbated by something else. But combat veterans, those who have dealt with trauma because of their military service, or in the first responder community, those who continue to deal with trauma because of their service in uniform. And we are a non-clinical program, so we approach this a little bit differently than other programs or organizations. Everyone who is a part of our program, who teaches, who is a team leader, who's a part of that week of programming, started out as a student. They came to our program because they needed help. And then we brought them through about a year-long process of getting them to the place where they could then stand up and teach a class. So it was very much peer-to-peer. You may think that your issues are unique or the world outside of you can't understand, but now you're in a room full of people with a similar background, similar experience. And so it's that eyeball to eyeball. I know where you are because I've been there. I've struggled the same way that you've struggled. In fact, I sat in that seat a year ago, but I've learned how to move forward. I don't have it all figured out, but together we can begin to move forward. So it's a very unique environment. We talk about trauma. We talk about all of these issues, but we move past them as quickly as we can because we want to acknowledge they happen. We have a class on post-traumatic stress disorder, but we spend the majority of our time talking about how to move forward in spite of what's happened to you, how to move toward that purpose for which you were created. And it's non-clinical. There are clinical programs, and those are helpful. But everyone we work with has access to those. So we try to model this behavior, this movement, this different way of looking at things, model it in our own lives. So we share a lot of stories and then help others to begin taking those steps themselves.
You've already mentioned that there's offices in Texas. There used to be one here in California.
Yeah.
So is it only available in person or is it an online?
Yeah. Our offices are in Texas, but we don't do programming at our offices. So we have facilities across the country. I say facilities, people think of like a hospital setting, ranches, conference centers. It's very non-clinical. We have a place in San Luis Obispo County up in Paso Robles here in California, 2 in Texas, 1 in Virginia, and 1 in Ohio. And we bring people to those locations. They spend a week with us. We cover the cost of the program, so there's no financial output. We cover the cost of travel. So wherever you are in the country, if you apply and we can get you into a program, we'll do what we need to do to get you there. So really, it's just 5 days of your time. The in-person part is very important. It's 5 days. So in that 5 days, hopefully you'll make some good decisions and take some steps forward. But it's really what happens after that becomes important. And so we'll walk that out with you as well. We have mentors, a lot of counselors available, a lot of folks that can help you take those next steps. Sometimes marriage issues will arise, or substance abuse, or just life issues that need to be counseled through. And so we have access to resources that will help you, and we'll walk through that with you as long as you'll let us. I mean, for the rest of your life, if you'll let us. So yeah, and then we do resiliency training or programs. We speak on military bases and in other environments where we're brought in to talk about what it means to live a resilient life, how to get ready for deployment, what to do now that you're on the other side of a deployment, and a lot of those questions as well. We've had tremendous opportunities with law enforcement agencies across the country. Here in California, we have a great relationship with the California Highway Patrol, which has been awesome. I've spoken at a few of their resiliency conferences, and their peer support unit, which it's a big department, so that's a full-time position. They use us as a resource for folks in their department, but we have been a part of training for police departments across the country, fire departments across the country, and so it's been really, really awesome. Yeah, I mean, my goal would be to get people to our 5-day program. It's intense, it's focused, it's the most helpful, but the resiliency training we've done hopefully provides the tools on the front end to prevent that train wreck that has to be recovered from. Yeah.
I'm going to take a pause just for a second. Let that trash
sure.
guy go by. Anything that we haven't hit that you want to make sure we hit on?
No, it's good. Okay. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, you do a good job walking through all this. How long have you been doing the podcast?
September will be 3 years.
All right. Yeah. That's good. Just decided to do a podcast.
Now I'll give you the full rundown afterwards.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it. I'm always interested in why people start. I've been doing our podcast mine for a long time. Some days I'm like, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. I can't see stopping.
It's definitely become a passion project.
Yeah.
It gives me so much more than it takes away from me, so to speak.
Yeah, that's good.
Don't let my wife hear that, though.
That's funny.
Continuing on with that, from your time now in being able to look back at your experiences in the military, the struggles you had when you came out, and now what you're able to give back through Mighty Oaks. You've already mentioned Highway Patrol and their resiliency program. So I can say from the law enforcement side, obviously I'm seeing definite improvement. What are you seeing from the military side as far as dealing with trauma, stress, building that resiliency?
I think the military is doing a much better job than they did, particularly in 2003 when I was trying to deal with this. When I checked out of the Marine Corps, every service does this, I'm sure, but in the Marine Corps, they have classes, and this has changed over time. But in 2003, there's 3 days of classes you have to go through, then you have to get signed off on before you can get out of the Marine Corps. And they're classes on medical processes, finances, finding a job, all these things. So you're getting out, we're going to cram all this in the last couple of days you're here. Anyhow, as an officer, I went to that class because I had to have it signed off on, just like everyone else did. And the staff sergeant running the class said, "Oh, hey, sir, come here. Give me your paperwork, signed off on it. Thanks for coming," right? That was my education on transitioning out of the Marine Corps.
And at the moment, you thought, hey, do me a solid.
That's amazing.
Great.
It's amazing. I'm going home. And it wasn't his fault. I mean, that's just how it's done, right? The military, speak to the Marine Corps, has become much more deliberate about not only mandating those classes for everyone, but talking about things like trauma. We weren't even talking about those things at the time. Giving opportunities for counseling, giving resources that you can reach out to after the fact. These were not available to people. If you weren't in the VA system, you didn't have anyone to reach out to. And so that's gotten much better. The other branches, we do conferences with the Air Force. They do what they call the Yellow Ribbon Program. And they do a conference that costs a lot of money and requires a full-time staff. They do conferences, I think 15 a year, for pre-deployers and post-deployers. So they get families together. They have this conference for the family before the service member deploys, and then after the service member deploys. And Yellow Ribbon Program exists in the Army, and the Navy has something similar. So doing a much, much better job. The problem is, maybe it's just the military. I don't know. I can't speak to the law enforcement side, but the military, there's a need. They do a good job meeting the need. And then it becomes very corporate. And now we got to check this box too, right? When there's a lot of Marines killing themselves, when there are a lot of service members killing themselves, suicide prevention is the thing. We invest money and time and resources. We don't care who's coming to speak, bring somebody in. And then that kind of moment passes. And so I think we're in that now where we're more in the check the box phase, particularly now that the wars have basically ended. I know there's still a lot going on, but we moved on to something else, and so we'll get back to it. It's this crazy thing we go back through again and again, which in part is why an organization like ours, and there are other great nonprofits, we have just taken it up on ourselves. We're going to write the resources. We're going to make ourselves available. We work very hard to raise money so that people don't have to pay to come to our programs because we know they need it. And so you hear this a lot, and this is just true though. If veterans don't take care of each other, then no one else is going to. The government tries. It will always fall short. And so I think they're doing much, much better. That was a really long answer to your question, but I think doing much, much better, at least talking about these issues. But at the end of the day, it's only as good as the person managing it. In a lot of places, that's just somebody's trying to get through it,
What's your opinion or the stance of Mighty Oaks on the use of psychedelics in helping trauma?
Yeah,
or address trauma.
Yeah, this is the big issue, right? Right now, this is the big discussion point. It was marijuana for a while. Now it's psychedelics. I could spend a lot of time talking about it, but I will say this. So as a faith-based organization, which we are, I would make this statement, and I think this is true whether you're a faith-based organization or not, that you need to have the right foundation to build your life on. And if your foundation isn't right, then anything else you use in the healing process is eventually going to fall short. I think if we don't start with answering the questions, who am I? This is touching on identity. And what is my purpose? What direction am I going? If you don't first have that in place, then all the medications in the world and the therapies in the world and all the other stuff, as helpful as those can be somewhere along the line, they're going to fall short. I feel like, and I've done a lot of reading and a lot of talking to people who are in the space right now, I feel like the psychedelic question and issue right now is another attempt to find a medication, something that will fix the problem without addressing the root issue of the problem, without asking the question, how did we get here in the first place? I've heard people talk about how it's been helpful to them. I've heard, people describe at length and read descriptions at length of the process and the therapies. I have personal opinions about it. I don't think it's helpful in the long term. That's my personal opinion. My professional opinion is that any medication, any therapy, anything that's used absent addressing the inner person who is broken and hurting because of trauma is going to fall short.
The only thing I would add to that is I'm not opposed to it if for that person they believe that it's going to work for them and or in their mind maybe they've exhausted every other resource. Mm-hmm. My thing is that I just don't want to see people give up. And there is not a single fix for everybody. Something's going to work differently for everyone. What I don't like seeing is there's still, and I use this analogy of, I think for a lot of people, there's still the stigmatism of the 60s when you say psychedelics.
Yeah.
To where a lot of people are still closed off to at least letting people try it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I come from a different place, right? In our program, we'll have people show up who are on more than 20 medications a day. That's not uncommon at all. And we're now talking about psychedelics, and what that means is for a lot of people, it's going to somewhere in South America or something and going whatever. But these prescribed medications are doing a lot of the same things, but they're not addressing the issues or addressing the problems. I don't want people to give up either. What I would say, though, is that if we're starting at the wrong end, eventually you're going to run out of road. And so I talk about this with any medication, any therapies. We would say, or let's say a therapist would say, you need to start with the therapies and start with the medication. And if things like faith and those things help somewhere along the line, then we'll engage with those too. What we say is let's flip that thing upside down and let's start with building the foundation of the inner man, who you are. And then if medication and therapies and things are helpful later on, then you add those. I just think we start from the wrong place. And so I can't speak to the chemistry of psychedelics. I've heard people describe a lot of their experiences with it. And, again, this is probably a different discussion, but I think there's a spiritual aspect to that for many people. But microdosing and those things people talk about, again, people talk about how helpful it is. I'm not going to argue that. Maybe it has been. But again, unless you address the actual issue that's going on inside of you, those things may be helpful for a time. Alcohol is helpful for a time. I would imagine the heroin addict, the first time they took it, they felt pretty good about their life in that moment, right? But you're not addressing the issue that's pushing you to use those. And so I guess that was kind of a wandering answer. But yeah, I'm not against things that help people, but help without addressing what's actually happening in your heart and in your mind, it's only temporary. And so you've got to get to the place where you can address that, have the right foundation, and then build your life on top of that.
Well, and I don't want to go down, as I'm saying it, I'm going down there, but I don't want to go down the bigger road of the bigger soapbox. What I will stop it at, it goes to the greater problem that we're seeing in society today with just this over-reliance on prescribing.
That's right.
And I have talked to quite a few veterans who, as soon as they express any issues, it's like, here. And pretty soon, before you know it, you're 10 or 15 pills in, and you don't know what's left or right. You're just kind of in this fog.
That's right. That is the answer, right? You can go into the conspiracy behind it and big pharma and all that. I don't know about all that, right? But I do know if you're a doctor that cares about people and you don't want them to kill themselves, then you're going to give them medication that's going to numb them out when they're talking about thoughts of self-harm and the rest. Okay. So you're not helping them. You're just putting a substance into their body that prevents them from taking the action that they're talking about, the things that they're thinking about, the things that they're emoting, right? And so, I guess I understand. I don't want them to hurt themselves, so I'll just drug them out. That's not helpful. It ruins them. It ruins their relationships. It puts them in a terrible place. They cannot grow past it. Our emotions were given to us for a reason. And so that is not the helpful answer. So, yeah. You're right.
And I'll just equate it to a physical trauma situation in combat, in law enforcement. A tourniquet is not the final
Right. That's right. That's
way
right.
to deal with the problem.
That's exactly right.
It's a temporary, but you've got to get deeper than the tourniquet and deal with the actual problem.
That's exactly right. And I think medication used for that purpose, and I've said this a lot, if someone needs, someone's going through hyper anxiety or whatever, and they can't have a conversation like the one we're having. They just can't. Their brain's moving too fast, whatever, and they need something to bring them back to a place. It's a tool. It's a tool that hopefully will help them get into an environment where they can actually have the conversations and make the decisions and get around the people and experience what they need to actually get well. So yeah, I think medication has its place. I wouldn't argue with anyone about psychedelics, I guess, but I guess in the right place, used the right way, I think they're probably more damaging in the long term than figuring out what the problem is and working to address that.
Going back to your wife, and because she is right, you're not right. She is. I'm just taking your wife's side.
Well, she would agree with you.
Post that decade where it took you to get back on your feet, besides the opportunities to give back and help others today, which I would assume is a huge help for you.
Yeah, huge.
What are the other things that are in your life today that are helping you keep moving forward?
A lot of it is that it's engaging with other people. It's understanding that my purpose in life is to help make people better and to use the resources, the opportunities, the time that I have for other people, that it's not about me. And I think that's a big turning point for a lot of people. When you realize that you have this life, it's precious, it's temporary, but you have an opportunity to invest it in other people, that changes your entire perspective. So that has been huge. That's been life-changing for me. Another part of that, I think, was, and I'll say this cautiously, but growth in my wife, in the sense that she matured. We were young when we got married and young during those moments. She matured to the point where instead of just protecting the kids and protecting herself and kind of going along with it, she really started to stand up against me saying things that were not right or acting in ways that were out of control. And so that's changed our relationship. And I believe you need to have people in your life outside of your spouse who can hold you accountable and who can call you out on your stuff. But her not letting me get away with it has been very, very helpful to me, because I'm not, 3 days down the road before I hear that, something bad happened. And it's been a while since we've had one of those moments, but that was a big part of it, I think, was her getting to the point personally where she just decided, I love my husband. I want our relationship to work, but it's not going to work the way it is. And so I need to start saying something and doing things. My wife's very strong. And that's been very, very helpful to me. And she does it in a loving way and in a way that is helpful, not hurtful to me. And then just having other people in my life that, I cut all the military people out of my life. Now I have a lot of military people in my life who can speak truth to me, and we speak the same language, and that's been very, very helpful as well. Yeah.
You mentioned your podcast. So what's the premise of it, and how often are you putting it out? Those kind of things for people who want to keep hearing more from you.
It's called the March or Die podcast, and the subtitle is Moving Forward When Your World is Falling Apart. And every week, so it comes out every Wednesday, every week I do my best, either on my own or with a guest, to talk about principles for moving forward. And sometimes it's based on a story, a person's life, something they've been through. But all of us know what it's like to experience those moments of, trials, traumas, difficulties, obstacles. And the question in those moments is, will you take the next step and continue to move forward, or will you stay where you are and die? Emotionally, relationally, are you going to give up? And we're always faced with that decision. And so the premise of the podcast is talking through principles, sometimes telling a story that will help us move forward in those moments where we just don't feel like it anymore.
And wrapping it up, any last pieces of advice for veterans and making their transition?
Yeah. Man, if you can have the right pieces in place before you make the transition, know that it's going to be hard. Get the right people around you. Start to ask the right questions. Go to a program like a Mighty Oaks program. There are some great books, and just start leaning into that transition process before you get there and look back and ask what happened. And then that's what happened to me. Being prepared ahead of time is huge. I would invite anyone who is veteran, active duty service member, first responder, spouse, to go to our website, check it out, fill out an application, attend our program, and we'd like to help you through that as well. But there's always hope. That's my one thought, I guess. There's always hope, but you've got to keep moving forward.
I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I appreciate you watching. But before you go, if you like the video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, any comments are appreciated. Thank you.